What if I told you that the real mystery isn't what people saw in the sky, but what happened after they saw it? Tonight, we're not going to talk about flying saucers or alien encounters in the way you might expect. Instead, we're going to examine something far more disturbing, the pattern of silence that follows these events. The systematic way that ordinary people, from police officers to school children, have been discouraged, intimidated, or simply ignored when they tried to tell the truth about what they witnessed. This is the story of how unexplained encounters don't end when the lights in the sky disappear. They end when someone decides the conversation is over. And tonight, we're going to ask a question that rarely gets asked. Who decides, and why does the pattern repeat itself across decades, across continents, and across countless witnesses who never knew each other existed? Welcome to Dreams of Disclosure. Let's talk about the architecture of silence. When we examine how authorities respond to mass sightings, Australia in the 1960s provides us with a perfect case study. The Westall Incident of April 6, 1966, demonstrates something critical about how unexplained aerial phenomena are managed when they can't be hidden. What makes Westall significant isn't just that over 200 students and teachers saw something unusual, it's that the response to their experience followed a pattern we'll see repeated again and again across the globe. Let me walk you through what actually happened in the aftermath. The day after the sighting, when students returned to school expecting discussion or explanation, they found instead a kind of institutional amnesia. Teachers who had looked up at the sky alongside their students now discouraged questions. The principal made no announcement. No assembly was called to address what had clearly disrupted an entire school day. This wasn't dramatic suppression with threats or confiscations. It was something subtler and perhaps more effective, the simple act of moving forward as if nothing had occurred. The local newspaper, The Age, published a brief article suggesting the object might have been a weather balloon. The explanation was offered quickly, casually, without the kind of detailed investigation you might expect for an event witnessed by hundreds of people in broad daylight. What's fascinating is that this explanation appeared before any thorough inquiry took place. The sequence matters here. First came the explanation, then came the expectation that everyone would accept it and return to normal life. But here's where the pattern gets interesting. When we look at declassified documents from Australia's Cold War era, we discover that the country was hosting sophisticated atmospheric monitoring programs that the public knew nothing about. The Highball program, operating out of Mildura in Victoria, launched enormous high-altitude balloons carrying complex scientific payloads designed to sample radiation from nuclear tests. These weren't simple weather balloons. They were massive, instrumented platforms that could appear very different from conventional aircraft, especially when viewed from certain angles or during descent phases. The revelation of these programs came decades too late to provide closure to the Westall witnesses. By the time the public learned about Highball and similar operations, the people who had watched the sky that April morning were already middle-aged, their children growing up with the story of the day something strange happened at school and nobody wanted to talk about it. This delay between event and context is itself part of the pattern. Information that might explain an incident is kept classified long enough that when it finally emerges, it can neither confirm nor deny the specific sighting in question. What we learn from Westall isn't necessarily that something extraordinary visited a Melbourne suburb. What we learn is how institutions handle events that don't fit neatly into existing categories. The response is neither aggressive denial nor transparent investigation. It's a kind of bureaucratic smoothing over, where unusual events are acknowledged briefly, explained tentatively, and then allowed to fade from official memory while remaining vivid in personal recollection. This creates a permanent gap between lived experience and official record. The students who ran toward the Grange where they believed something had landed carried that memory into adulthood. Some described seeing ground traces, flattened grass, areas that looked disturbed. But because no official investigation documented the site immediately, and because the landowner later burned the area, whatever physical evidence might have existed was lost. not destroyed through conspiracy, but simply through the passage of time and the ordinary actions of people who had land to manage and didn't want curious teenagers trespassing. The Westall case teaches us that silence doesn't require coordination. It emerges naturally when institutions prioritize order over inquiry, when the path of least resistance is to offer a simple explanation and move on. The weather balloon narrative served its purpose not because it was thoroughly convincing, but because it was sufficiently plausible to give people permission to stop asking questions.
Now let's expand our view beyond Australia and ask whether this pattern of response exists elsewhere. When we examine cases from Japan, Chile, Brazil, and the United States during the same Cold War period, we find something remarkable. The same sequence of events playing out in cultures that had no direct communication with each other. Consider the Kofu City Vineyard Landing in Japan, February 1975. Two 7-year-old boys encountered something so disturbing that their terror was immediately apparent to everyone who saw them run home. They described a domed craft that landed in a vineyard, beings with wrinkled metallic faces and clawed hands, and a moment of paralysis when one of the creatures touched a child's shoulder. The boys drew pictures independently that matched in their grotesque details. Neighbors confirmed seeing unusual lights over the vineyard that same evening. Police found unexplained soil disturbances at the location the children described. The local newspaper published the story, including the children's drawings. And then what happened? The same institutional quiet that followed Westall. No national investigation, no follow-up by scientific authorities, no attempt to reconcile the children's detailed, consistent testimony with any known phenomenon. The case simply remained as a local oddity, documented briefly and then left to fade into folklore. What makes the Kofu incident particularly significant is how different the described beings were from popular depictions of aliens in media at that time. These weren't the smooth-faced, large-eyed creatures of science fiction. They were grotesque, wrinkled, clawed, genuinely frightening. If children were going to invent a story or unconsciously draw on cultural imagery, why would they choose details so unlike anything they'd seen in films or books? This question was asked by Japanese researchers, but never adequately answered by authorities.
Moving to South America, the Colaris Flap in Brazil during late 1977 presents an even more intense version of this pattern. For weeks, residents of a small fishing island reported glowing objects that descended low over homes, shining beams at people that caused burns, weakness, and other physical effects. The Brazilian Air Force didn't dismiss these reports. They actually deployed a team under Operation Saucer to document the phenomenon. They took photographs, they collected testimony, they noted electrical interference, they observed the objects themselves. And then, for decades, they said nothing publicly. The operation's files remained classified until 2004. When they were finally released, they confirmed everything the islanders had described: unknown aerial objects, beams that affected people physically, patterns of activity that defied conventional explanation. But this confirmation came 27 years too late to help the people who had experienced the events, who had been left to wonder whether their government believed them or thought them delusional. Chile's San Clemente wave of 1978 follows the identical pattern. Farmers, truck drivers, police officers, and military pilots all reported structured objects behaving in ways that didn't match known aircraft. The Chilean Air Force acknowledged internally that radar had tracked unknown targets. Navy patrols noted unusual lights corresponding to ground sightings. Yet no public statement was made. No coordinated investigation was announced. The wave of sightings simply continued until it didn't, and then everyone moved on. What emerges when we look at these cases together isn't evidence of a single conspiracy spanning multiple nations. It's something perhaps more interesting: a shared institutional reflex,
When confronted with events that don't fit existing frameworks, organizations default to the same response regardless of culture or political system. Document quietly, if at all. Offer mundane explanations where possible. Avoid public engagement. Let time do the work of fading the incident from collective memory. This reflex serves a practical purpose. Institutions require predictability to function. When something genuinely anomalous occurs, it creates a problem that can't be easily solved. You can't investigate what you can't explain using existing tools. You can't reassure the public when you don't have reassuring answers. The safest path is to minimize, contextualize with familiar references like weather balloons or atmospheric phenomena, and then quietly close the file.
But let's shift our focus now from institutions to individuals, because this is where the pattern of silence becomes truly unsettling. We need to talk about what happens to the people who see these things, not in terms of what they witnessed, but in terms of what they experienced afterward in their daily lives. The Men in Black phenomenon represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of this entire subject. And I want to be clear about something from the start. I'm not going to tell you who or what the Men in Black are, because nobody actually knows. What we can examine is the consistency of reports across decades and continents describing encounters with individuals who appeared after UFO sightings to discourage witnesses from speaking publicly. Timothy Green Beckley spent decades collecting these accounts. What makes his files valuable isn't that they prove the Men in Black are real in any specific sense, it's that they document a pattern of intimidation that affected ordinary people in their homes. A family in New Jersey reports strange lights, contacts a newspaper, and within days receives a visit from men in dark suits who search their house without permission and instruct them to forget what they saw. A teenager in New York describes a disc-shaped craft to his mother, and the next day, men claiming to be government agents arrive to tell the family the boy was mistaken and that spreading such stories is dangerous. The psychological impact of these visits was profound and long-lasting. People who had been willing to talk about their sightings fell silent. Some refused to ever discuss the subject again. Others reported feeling watched for months or years afterward. The intimidation wasn't typically physical. It was the invasion of private space, the implication of authority, the message that someone was paying attention and that speaking further would have consequences. What's particularly strange about many of these accounts is the detailed descriptions of the visitors themselves. Witnesses often described the men as somehow off, as if they were attempting to appear human but not quite succeeding. Outdated clothing, mechanical speech patterns, expressionless faces, movements that seemed slightly wrong. These details appeared too consistently across independent reports to be entirely coincidental, yet they're also too bizarre to fit any conventional explanation of government agents conducting normal intimidation. Some researchers have suggested the Men in Black are psychological phenomena, manifestations of guilt or fear, rather than physical visitors. Others maintain they're real but human, perhaps intelligence operatives using psychological tactics to discourage UFO discussions during the Cold War. Still others believe there's something stranger, connected to the phenomenon itself rather than to human authorities. The truth is, we don't know. What we do know is that the reports exist, they follow consistent patterns, and they affected real people in measurable ways. The intimacy of these encounters is what makes them so disturbing. This isn't about distant lights in the sky. It's about someone knocking on your door, entering your home, and making you feel unsafe in the one place you should feel secure. It's about children being told by adults who feel threatened themselves that they need to stop talking about what they saw. It's about the erosion of the simple right to speak about one's own experience. And here's what ties this back to one larger pattern. The Men in Black phenomenon, whether psychological or physical, serves the same function as institutional silence. It discourages communication. It isolates witnesses. It makes people question whether speaking up is worth the cost. In doing so, it ensures that most sightings remain private experiences rather than public knowledge, scattered points of data that never connect into a larger picture.
So what are we left with when we step back and look at this pattern as a whole? We have mass sightings that are witnessed by credible observers, documented briefly, explained inadequately, and then allowed to fade. We have physical evidence that is either not collected, not analyzed, or not released. We have witness testimony that remains consistent over decades but is never officially validated. And we have a recurring structure of response that appears independent of culture, political system, or specific phenomenon reported. This creates what I call the architecture of unknowing. It's not quite a cover-up in the traditional sense, because that would require active coordination and a clear goal. What we're looking at is more subtle. It's a system where the default response to anomalous events is to minimize, deflect, and move on, where classified programs ensure that even plausible explanations can't be offered in real time, where the gap between what witnesses experience and what authorities acknowledge becomes permanent. The question we should ask isn't necessarily whether these sightings represent extraterrestrial visitation or secret military technology or natural phenomena we don't yet understand. The question is why, regardless of what these events actually are, the response to them follows such a predictable pattern. Why does silence serve so many different interests simultaneously? It serves institutions by avoiding difficult questions. It serves military and intelligence agencies by preventing discussion of classified programs. It serves skeptics by allowing unusual events to be dismissed through lack of official validation. And paradoxically, it even serves believers by preserving the mystery that makes the subject compelling. What gets lost in this architecture are the witnesses themselves. The students at Westall who watched something unexplainable and were never given a satisfying answer. The children in Kofu who encountered something terrifying and lived with that memory alone. The residents of Colaris who experienced physical effects from unknown beams and waited decades for even partial acknowledgement. The countless individuals who saw something strange, reported it honestly, and then found themselves navigating a world that had no framework for taking them seriously. The pattern of silence we've examined tonight isn't about proving or disproving any particular case. It's about understanding how societies handle encounters with the genuinely unknown. What we've seen is that the response is remarkably consistent. Brief acknowledgement, quick explanation, and then a return to normalcy that leaves witnesses carrying their experiences alone. This pattern serves a function. It maintains social order, it prevents panic, it protects classified information, but it also ensures that we never quite get to the truth, whatever that truth might be. Because the truth requires sustained inquiry, transparent investigation, and most importantly, a willingness to say we don't know when we genuinely don't. Maybe the real disclosure we need isn't about aliens or secret technology. Maybe it's simply about creating space for people to speak honestly about extraordinary experiences without fear of ridicule, intimidation, or institutional dismissal. Because until we can do that, the architecture of unknowing will remain firmly in place, and the pattern will continue to repeat itself every time someone looks up and sees something that shouldn't be there. The question I'll leave you with tonight is this: what would it take to break this pattern? Not to solve every mystery, but simply to allow witnesses to speak and investigators to investigate without the automatic reflex towards silence. Because until we answer that question, every new sighting will follow the same path as Westall, as Kofu, as Colaris, documented briefly, explained inadequately, and then allowed to fade into the uncertain space between official record and personal memory. Thank you for joining us tonight. If these patterns intrigue you as much as they intrigue me, subscribe to the channel and join us tomorrow as we continue exploring the architecture of unknowing. Until then, keep looking up, and more importantly, keep asking why some questions are never quite answered. Good night.